They called me his luck bringer, but I was the one who sharpened the needle that would eventually stop his heart. Looking back, I should have known that you can't save a king by falling for the man, not when the stars have already tasted his blood. My name is Maren, and I was born with a curse. I am the only one who can destroy the Lycan King, but I didn't realize that to kill him, I'd have to lose my soul to the very fire I was sent to extinguish. I came to the Skyreach Citadel to end a prophecy, but instead, I became the reason it was written. They say love is a choice, but when the Weaver of Woe is holding the pen, your only choice is which part of you is going to bleed first. I was born in the dark, and the dark is where the stars told me I would kill him. The salt cave felt like a grave. Maren sat on the cold floor, her legs tucked tight to her chest because the damp air bit at her skin. Her pack, the northern craters, kept her here like a prized dagger hidden in a drawer. She was their seer, their only hope against the blood debt they owed. In her mind, the vision played again. She saw a massive black wolf, a king among monsters collapsing in the snow. She saw herself standing over him. At that moment, she felt a hollow ache in her chest. Deep down, she knew the truth. Her life was never her own. It belonged to a prophecy of death. Without warning, the heavy stone door groaned open. Her alpha, a man with eyes like flint and a heart of ice, stepped into the dim light. He didn't offer a hand or a kind word. Instead, he tossed a small leather wrap at her feet. Inside was a silver needle, long and thin, glinting with a lethal light. "The king is moving," the alpha growled. Maren's voice trembled. "I've seen it. He dies in the frost." "Then go," he commanded. "If he lives through the winter, the Weaver of Woe will claim your sister's soul instead." Because of that threat, Maren didn't argue. She stood up, her joints popping in the silence. She was only 22, yet she felt 1,000 years old. She had everything to lose, her sister, her home, her very soul, if she failed to be the monster the stars demanded. After that, she walked out of the cave for the first time in 3 years. The sun hit her face, and for a second she was blinded. The world was too big, too loud, and too bright. Truth be told, she wanted to run back into the dark. But then she remembered the vision of the king's blood on the white snow. Next, the trek began. Maren moved through the mountain passes like a ghost. Her magic was a heavy weight, a buzzing beneath her skin that she couldn't turn off. Every step she took away from the cave felt like a step toward a cliff. She was a weapon on a mission, and weapons didn't get to feel the warmth of the sun. Soon after, she reached the border of the Skyreach Citadel. The air here smelled different. It smelled of pine, of fresh kills, and of a power so thick it made her throat tighten. She shifted into her wolf form, her bones snapping and reforming with a familiar, agonizing heat. Her wolf was small and white, a stark contrast to the shadows of the forest. What followed was the first sign of the king. She heard him before she saw him. A roar ripped through the trees, a sound so primal it made her fur stand on end. Maren crept closer, her heart skipping a beat. She saw him, King Valerius. He was huge, a beast of shadow and muscle, fighting off 3 rogues who had dared to cross his path. Still, something was wrong. Maren's magic began to pulse. It didn't feel like a weapon. It felt like a shield. As she watched, a massive rogue lunged for the king's throat. Without thinking, Maren's power leaked out of her. It wasn't a strike. It was a nudge of fate. A heavy branch above the rogue snapped, falling perfectly to knock the attacker off balance. Yet, she was supposed to let him die. Instead, she had just saved his life. Maren froze in the brush, her breath caught in her throat. The king stood over the fallen rogues, his golden eyes scanning the forest. And he looked like a god of war, but he also looked exhausted. Even so, he didn't look for an enemy. He looked for her. In a single heartbeat, the world shifted. Their eyes locked through the tangled branches. Maren felt it, etched in fire. A bond she didn't understand flared between them, hot and terrifying. Before she could move, Valerius shifted. He didn't care that he was naked and bleeding in the snow. He walked toward her hiding spot, his gait heavy but certain. Maren wanted to snarl, to bite, to run, but her wolf pressed forward, drawn to the heat radiating from his body. At that moment, the king spoke. His voice was a low rumble that vibrated in her chest. "You," he whispered. Maybe it was fate, or maybe it was a trap. Maren shifted back, her human skin shivering in the cold. She didn't have her silver needle yet. She only had her lies. "I am a traveller," she lied, her voice small. "I bring luck." As the silence stretched, Valerius reached out. He didn't touch her, but the space between them burned. He looked at her not as a hunter, but as a man who had finally found water in a desert. "Luck?" he echoed, a bitter smile touching his lips. "I was told I was cursed to die alone. Why has the moon sent me a girl with starlight in her eyes?" Maren didn't know what scared her more, the king or the fact that she didn't want to destroy him anymore. She looked at his scars, the marks of a man who had fought for every breath. "I am here to serve the king," she said, the lie tasting like ash. What's worse was the look of pure, raw relief on his face. He believed her. He was a warrior who had survived everything, but he was defenseless against a kind word. To make things worse, the Weaver of Woe whispered in the back of her mind, "Kill him or lose your sister." Moments later, Valerius draped his heavy fur cloak around her shoulders. It smelled of wood smoke and him. It was the first time she had been warm in years. By the time they reached the gates of the Skyreach citadel, the pack was watching. They saw their king bringing in a small, pale girl with the eyes of an oracle. They didn't see the assassin. They saw a miracle. Eventually, Valerius led her to a room filled with soft furs and the glow of a fire. He stood at the door, his silhouette blocking the light. "Rest, Luckbringer," he said. "Tomorrow you shall tell me my future." That night, Maren lay awake. The silver needle sat in her palm, its point sharp and cold. She was in his heart now. She was his luck, his joy, and his hope. Come morning, she would have to decide if she was brave enough to break his heart to save her own. But for now, the citadel held its breath, and the stars waited for the blood to fall. But then she heard a howl from the mountains. It wasn't a wolf. It was something darker, something ancient. The Weaver was watching, and the clock was ticking. Instead of sleeping, Maren stared at the ceiling. She realized that every time she was near him, her magic grew stronger. It wasn't killing him. It was making him a god. Rather than fear the power, she felt a spark of rebellion. If the stars could lie to her, maybe she could lie to the stars. Meanwhile, in the shadows of the hallway, Valerius watched her door. He felt the pull, the ache of a fated bond he thought was impossible. As a result, he didn't see the danger. He only saw the girl. So, for the stage was set, a king who wanted to be loved, and a girl who was meant to be his end, which meant that the next few days would either save the world or burn it to the ground. Truth be told, Maren had never felt so alive, and that was the most dangerous thing of all. No matter how hard she tried, she couldn't forget the way he looked at her. It wasn't the look of a monster. It was the look of a man who was ready to be saved. She felt it, etched in fire. Her soul answered him before her mind could protest. In the span of a breath, she made a choice. She would stay. She would play the part. As if pulled by a string, she walked to the window and looked at the moon. It was full and bright, a silent witness to her betrayal. Without thinking, she touched the mark on her wrist, the one that bound her to the prophecy. It tingled with a dark heat. The tension broke when she heard his footsteps outside her door again. He was guarding her. As her wolf stirred, she realized that she wasn't just hiding from the king. She was hiding from herself. With every step he took, the bond pulsed louder. And she let it happen, because deep down she wanted to see what happened when a star finally fell. The prophecy was clear, but the heart was a messy, unpredictable thing. Maren clutched the silver needle until it drew blood from her thumb. The game had begun, and there were no rules in the dark. The silver needle stung her palm, but the heat coming from the hallway was what truly burned. The morning air in the Skyreach citadel was sharp and smelled like pine needles and raw potential. Maren stood by her window, watching the pack members shift and stretch in the courtyard below. They moved with a freedom she had never known, their bodies snapping from fur to skin under the rising sun. Because of the prophecy, she had spent her life expecting monsters, but these people looked like a family. Without warning, a heavy knock rattled her door. Her heart skipped a beat, and she quickly shoved the silver needle into the waistband of her leather trousers. "Enter," she called out, her voice steadier than she felt. What followed was Valerius. He didn't look like a king this morning. He looked like a storm held in a human bottle. He wore only simple trousers, his broad chest covered in faint white scars that told stories of battles she hadn't seen in her visions. "The pack is restless," Valerius said, his golden eyes locking onto hers. "They think you are a sign, a blessing from the moon to end the winter that has gripped our hearts." Still, Maren felt the cold weight of her lie pressing against her ribs. "I only see what the stars allow, Valerius. I am a traveller, not a saviour." Yet, as he stepped closer, the air thickened. The space between them burned with a physical intensity that made her wolf whine at the back of her mind. He was so close she could smell the mountain rain on his skin. "I don't believe in saviours," he whispered, his hand reaching out to catch a stray lock of her hair. "But since you arrived, the void in my head has been quiet. That is a miracle I can't ignore." Soon after, he led her down to the great hearth. The entire pack was gathered, hundreds of wolves in human form, their eyes tracking her every movement. They were waiting for a sign. They were waiting for her to speak the words that would fix their world. Instead of a blessing, Maren felt a surge of panic. Her magic began to leak again, a golden hum vibrating in her marrow. She looked at the crowd and saw a young boy standing near a boiling pot of stew. In a single heartbeat, the world shifted. She saw the chain holding the pot snapping. She saw the scalding liquid falling toward the child. Rather than thinking, her body moved on instinct. She lunged forward, her hand outstretched. She didn't touch the chain, but her magic hit it like a physical blow, wrapping around the metal and holding it in place just as the link gave way. The silence that followed was deafening. The pack gasped, and the boy's mother fell to her knees, clutching her son. Maren stood there, her hand shaking as the golden glow faded from her skin. What's worse was the look on Valerius's face. It wasn't just admiration, it was devotion. He walked toward her, his footsteps echoing in the silent hall. "You saved him," he murmured, loud enough for everyone to hear. "The oracle has brought more than luck. She has brought life." To make things worse, a shadow flickered in the corner of Maren's eye. It was a tall, thin figure dressed in the tattered rags of her own pack, the Northern Craters. It was a messenger. Her alpha's eyes peered from beneath a hood, cold and demanding. He held up a single finger, then dragged it across his throat. The message was clear: kill the king now, or your sister dies today. By the time Maren reached the gardens to confront the messenger, he was gone, leaving only the scent of salt and rot behind. Because of that threat, she felt as if the world were narrowing, closing in on her from all sides. Eventually she found herself back in the forest with Valerius. He had insisted on a walk to clear his head. He seemed lighter, as if the miracle in the hall had given him permission to hope. "You're quiet," he said, stopping by a frozen waterfall. "Is the future showing you something dark?" Truth be told, Maren wanted to scream the truth. She wanted to tell him she was the shadow in his house. But then he turned to her, and the moonlight caught the raw vulnerability in his expression. "I've spent my whole life waiting for the end," he said, his voice trembling. "I thought my death would be the only way to save my people. But looking at you, I want to live, Maren. For the first time, I want to see the spring." No matter how hard she tried, she couldn't pull away when he cupped her face. His skin was like fire against her cold cheeks. "Don't," she whispered, even as she leaned into his touch. "You don't know me." Maybe it was fate, but Valerius didn't listen. He leaned down, his breath ghosting over her lips. "I know the way your soul calls to mine," he said. "I know that my wolf wants to kneel at your feet." Before either could speak, he kissed her. It wasn't a gentle kiss, it was an explosion of suppressed desire and desperate need. As fire bloomed beneath her skin, Maren forgot the needle. She forgot her sister. She forgot the stars. Between them, something cracked. The prophecy she had carried like a shield shattered in the heat of his mouth. Her bones remembered him, as if they had been carved from the same mountain. But then the ground began to shake. The ice on the waterfall splintered and a low, guttural growl echoed through the trees. It wasn't a wolf. It was something far larger, a mass of shadows and glowing purple eyes. "The Weaver!" Maren gasped, pulling back. As the sky darkened, the shadow creature lunged. It didn't go for Valerius. It went for Maren. In a single heartbeat, the world shifted. Valerius didn't hesitate. He shifted mid-air, his clothes tearing as his massive black wolf form exploded into existence. He intercepted the shadow, his jaws snapping on air that felt like cold smoke. As if the forest watched, the two forces clashed. Valerius fought with a ferocity that terrified her, but the shadow didn't bleed. It just reformed, swirling around him like a toxic cloud. She felt it, etched in fire. Valerius was losing. The luck she provided wasn't enough to fight a god. Without thinking, Maren reached into her magic. She didn't look for a vision. She looked for a way to hurt the dark. She grabbed the silver needle from her waist and held it up to the moon. "I am the end of him," she screamed, her voice echoing in the clearing. "But not today." She plunged the needle into the earth at her feet, pouring every ounce of her leaking magic into the ground. A wave of white light erupted from the spot, slamming into the shadow creature and tearing it apart. In the quiet that followed, the forest held its breath. Valerius shifted back, gasping for air as he slumped to his knees. He looked at the smoking hole in the ground, then up at Maren. "What was that?" he asked, his voice raw. She didn't know what scared her more: the Weaver's attack, nor the fact that she had just used her assassination tool to save her target again. As the bond pulsed between them, Maren realized she had crossed the point of no return. She had chosen him over the prophecy. She had chosen him over her pack. Which meant she had just signed her sister's death warrant. Her chest ached as she looked at Valerius, who was now standing and reaching for her. She let him pull her into his arms, hiding her face against his neck. And she let it happen, because she knew the Weaver wouldn't stop until one of them was dead. The stars hadn't lied about the ending. They had just lied about who would be holding the knife. The game had changed. She wasn't just an assassin anymore. She was a traitor to fate itself. The smell of ozone and burnt shadows hung in the air. But the weight of Valerius's arms around her felt heavier than any magic. The walk back to the citadel was silent, the kind of silence that roars in your ears until you can't think. Maren kept her head down, her mind spinning with the image of her alpha's cold eyes and the memory of her sister's face. She had saved the king twice now, which meant she was failing the only people who had ever kept her fed and sheltered. Because of the kiss, her blood felt like it was made of liquid starlight, humming with a frequency that belonged only to the man walking beside her. Without warning, they reached the courtyard. The pack was still there, but the atmosphere had shifted from celebration to fear. They had felt the ground shake, and they knew the darkness was coming for their home. "My king!" an elder wolf called out, his voice trembling. "Oh, the shadows. They are getting stronger. Is the oracle's luck failing us?" What followed was a moment of pure, raw leadership. Valerius stepped forward, his hand still gripping Maren's. He looked like a god of the mountain, tall and unyielding against the rising wind. "The oracle saved me from a nightmare tonight," Valerius announced, his golden eyes sweeping over his people. "The darkness is real, but so is our strength. We will not hide anymore." Still, Maren felt like a fraud. Every cheer from the pack was a slap to her face, a reminder that she was the one who had brought the silver needle into their sanctuary. She watched as Valerius began to organize the scouts, his mind already on the coming war. Yet, as the crowd dispersed, Maren felt a tug on her sleeve. It was the young boy she had saved earlier. He looked up at her with eyes full of wonder and handed her a small polished stone. "For the luck-bringer," he whispered, before running back to his mother. Soon after, Maren escaped to the training grounds, needing the bite of the cold air to clear her thoughts. She began to move, her wolf stirring beneath her skin, demanding to be let out. She shifted, her white fur glowing under the half-moon, and began to run. She pushed herself until her lungs burned and her paws ached, trying to outrun the prophecy that was currently breathing down her neck. Instead of peace, she found a challenge. A massive grey wolf stepped into her path, its fur bristling with aggression. It was the pack beta, a woman named Hera who had watched Maren with suspicion since the first hour. Rather than growling, Hera shifted back into her human form, standing naked and defiant in the snow. You say you bring luck, but all I see is a girl who makes our king weak. Why does he look at you like you are the moon itself? Maren shifted back, her breath hitching in the frost. He sees what he wants to see, Hera. I am just a girl. What's worse was Hera's laugh, a dry hacking sound. You are a weapon, little bird. I can smell the salt of the northern craters on you. If you hurt him, I will rip your throat out myself. To make things worse, the mark on Maren's wrist began to tingle. It was a sign that the weaver was close again, or perhaps just a reminder that her time was running out. By the time Maren returned to the citadel, her thoughts were a tangled mess of loyalty and desire. Eventually, she was summoned to Valerius's private study. The room was lit by a single fire, casting long, dancing shadows against the stone walls. He was standing by a map of the mountains, his brow furrowed in concentration. I need to know the truth, Maren, he said without turning around. The thing that attacked us tonight. It wasn't a rogue. It was a piece of the void. Truth be told, she couldn't lie to him anymore. Not when he looked so broken and so hopeful all at once. It's called the Weaver of Woe, she said, her voice barely a whisper. It's an ancient deity that feeds on the death of kings. It was the one who wrote the prophecy about your end. No matter how hard she tried, she couldn't look away when he finally turned to face her. The firelight turned his golden eyes into pools of molten amber. And you? He asked, stepping into her space. Where do you fit into the Weaver's plan? Maybe it was fate, or maybe it was her own heartbreaking, but Maren reached out and touched the scars on his chest. I was sent to be the hand that holds the knife, she confessed, the words finally tumbling out. I was sent to kill you so my pack could live. Before either could speak, the air in the room turned ice cold. The fire sputtered and died, leaving them in total darkness. In a single heartbeat, the world shifted. Maren didn't wait for the shadow to strike. She threw herself in front of Valerius, her magic erupting in a blind, golden flash that filled the room. As if summoned, a voice hissed from the corners of the ceiling. The blood debt must be paid, little seer. Give us the king, or watch your sister wither. As the sky darkened outside the window, Maren realized the citadel was no longer a sanctuary. It was a cage. While her pulse raced, she felt Valerius's hands on her shoulders turning her to face him. He wasn't angry. He wasn't reaching for a weapon. With a single glance, he saw everything, her fear, her silver needle, and the love she was trying so hard to bury. Then kill me, he whispered, his forehead resting against hers. If my life is the price for your sister's, take it. I would rather die by your hand than live a day without you. Between them, something cracked. It wasn't just the prophecy. It was the last of Maren's resolve. As her wolf stirred, she realized that she could never do it. She would rather burn the world down than see him fall. With every heartbeat, the bond pulsed like a drum. It was a fated connection that was stronger than any dark god's decree, and she let it happen because the only way to destroy the king was to make him hers forever. The game was no longer about survival. It was about war. Maren looked out at the shadows gathering at the gate. and knew that the weaver had underestimated one thing: a woman with nothing left to lose. Before the words left her lips, she felt the mark on her wrist go cold. The debt was overdue, and the northern craters were at the door. The cold from the floor seeped into her bones, but the ice in Valerius's words was what truly froze her heart. The darkness in the study felt like a living thing, pressing against Maren's skin with invisible needles. She could feel the heat of Valerius's body just inches away, yet the truth she had just confessed created a canyon between them. Because of her confession, the air tasted of copper and regret, a bitter reminder that she was still a prisoner of her own past. She waited for him to growl or to shift, to cast her out into the snow where her alpha was waiting to end her. Without warning, the shadows in the room pulled back, not because the light returned, but because Valerius's own presence seemed to expand. He didn't reach for her throat. Rather, he took her shaking hands in his grip firm and steady. "You think your pack is the only thing that matters?" he asked, his voice a low vibration that rattled her ribs. "You think I would let some shadow god or a cave-dwelling alpha dictate who lives and dies in my mountains?" What followed was a plan born of desperation and a sudden sharp clarity. Valerius moved to the heavy oak desk, pulling a map from the drawer that showed the secret tunnels beneath the Skyreach citadel. He pointed to a jagged line that led toward the northern crags, the very place Maren had escaped from. "Or we aren't going to wait for them to breach the gates," he declared, his eyes flashing with a predatory light. "We are going to give them exactly what they want. They want the king. They can have him." Still, Maren shook her head, her breath hitching in her chest. "It's a trap, Valerius. The Weaver wants you to come to the salt caves. That's where the veil is thinnest. If you go there, he will swallow you whole." Yet, the king only smiled, a dark and dangerous expression that made her wolf howl with a mix of fear and pride. He looked at her not as a victim, but as his equal in this twisted game of fate. Soon after, the citadel erupted into a flurry of silent activity. Maren watched as Valerius gave orders to Hera, the pack beta, who still looked at Maren like she was a rot in the woods. They were preparing for a feint, a massive distraction at the main gates while the king and his oracles slipped through the belly of the mountain. Instead of a blessing, Maren felt a surge of overwhelming guilt as she saw the boy she had saved clutching his mother's hand. They were fighting for a lie, and she was the one who had told it. Rather than running, she found herself sharpening the silver needle on a whetstone in the armory. The sound of metal on stone was a rhythmic heartbeat, a reminder that every second brought her sister closer to death. She looked at her reflection in the polished surface and didn't recognize the girl staring back. What's worse was the midpoint shift that occurred just as they reached the entrance to the tunnels. A messenger bird, its feathers stained with purple shadow, landed on the stone archway. It carried a single scrap of white silk, a piece of her sister's dress. In a single heartbeat, the world shifted. Maren realized the weaver wasn't waiting for the blood debt to be paid. In fact, he was already consuming her sister to gain the strength needed to manifest. To make things worse, Valerius saw the silk and knew immediately what it meant. The stakes were no longer about a crown or a pack. More importantly, they were about the soul of an innocent girl being used as a battery for a dark god. By the time they entered the damp, narrow tunnels, Maren's magic was leaking so heavily that she left a trail of golden sparks on the walls. Eventually, they reached the echo chamber, a massive cavern halfway between the citadel and the northern border. The air here was thick with the scent of wet fur and ancient decay. Maren stopped, to her instincts screaming at her to turn back. "Something is here," she whispered, her hand instinctively going to the silver needle at her waist. Truth be told, she was right. From the darkness emerged her alpha, his skin looking grey and translucent, his eyes glowing with that same sickly purple light she had seen in the forest. He wasn't a man anymore. He was a vessel. "You're late, Maren," the alpha hissed, his voice sounding like 1,000 dead leaves. "The weaver is hungry and the sister is almost spent." No matter how hard she tried, Maren couldn't stop the sob that escaped her throat. She stepped forward, but Valerius moved faster, his body shielding her from the alpha's gaze. "Step aside, ghost," Valerius growled, his muscles bunching as he prepared to shift. "You've bullied a girl in a cave for too long. And try your luck with a king." Maybe it was fate. But the alpha didn't fight back with claws. Instead, he raised a hand, and a wave of shadow slammed into Valerius, pinning him against the cavern wall with the force of a mountain. Before either could speak, the alpha turned his gaze to Maren. "The prophecy says the king dies by your hand. Seer, do it now, and I will let the girl's soul go. Do it, or watch her become a hollow shell." In a single heartbeat, the world shifted. Maren looked at Valerius, who was struggling against the shadow, his face contorted in pain. Then she looked at the silver needle in her hand. The midpoint shift was complete. She wasn't just choosing between her sister and her lover. She was choosing between the old world of prophecies and a new world where she made the rules. As if the world narrowed. She didn't strike Valerius. Instead, she turned the needle on herself, pressing the point against the mark on her own wrist. "I am the end of the prophecy," she screamed, her voice echoing until the cavern roared. While her pulse raced, she realized that her leaking magic was the key. She wasn't just a luck bringer, she was a conduit. If she destroyed her own connection to the stars, the weaver would lose his tether to this world. With a single glance at Valerius, she saw the terror in his eyes. He knew what she was doing. He knew the cost of breaking a seer's bond. Between them, something cracked. The golden light from her wrist flared, blinding and hot, as she sliced through the mark. The shadow holding Valerius shattered instantly, and the alpha let out a soul-piercing shriek as the purple light was sucked out of him. As her wolf stirred, Maren felt the connection to the stars snap. The silence that followed was heavy and cold. She fell to her knees, her breath coming in ragged gasps as the gold bled out of her skin and into the stone. With every heartbeat, she felt the void closing in. She had broken the prophecy, but she had also broken herself. And she let it happen because for the first time in her life, she couldn't see the future. The darkness was total, but it was her darkness. The air thickened as Valerius scrambled toward her, catching her before she hit the ground. He held her tight, his heart a frantic drum against her ear. "What did you do?" he choked out, his voice filled with a raw, agonizing love. She looked up at him, her vision blurring at the edges. "I destroyed the king's end," she whispered. "But I think I destroyed the oracle. Too." The game had entered its most dangerous phase. The weaver was silenced for now, but the northern craters were still coming. And Maren was no longer a seer. She was just a girl with a bleeding wrist and a man who would burn the world to keep her warm. The stone felt like ice beneath her knees, but the warmth of Valerius's hands was the only thing keeping Maren from dissolving into the shadows. The echo chamber was still, the purple glow of the weaver's influence fading into a dull, sickly grey. Maren stared at her wrist, where the golden light had once pulsed. Now there was only a jagged red line and a hollow silence in her mind. Because she had severed her bond with the stars, the constant hum of the future had vanished, leaving her blind to what came next. She felt a strange, terrifying freedom. Yet the price of that liberty was the sudden realization that she was now just a girl in the middle of a war. Without warning, the tunnel behind them rumbled. The sound of dozens of paws hitting the stone floor echoed through the cavern, signaling that the northern craters had found the entrance. "They're coming," Valerius growled, his voice a low, predatory rumble that vibrated through Maren's chest. What followed was a moment of impossible sacrifice. Valerius didn't look at the tunnel. He looked at Maren, his eyes blazing with a fierce, protective light. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small leather pouch, the same one she had used to hide the silver needle. "Take this," he commanded, pressing it into her hand. "It's a map to the mountain sanctuary. If we get separated, you go there. You wait for me." Still, Maren shook her head, her fingers gripping his tunic. "I'm not leaving you. I destroyed the prophecy so we could fight together, not so I could run alone." Yet, the king's expression didn't soften. Rather, it hardened into the mask of a leader who had already made his peace with the cost of victory. Soon after, the first of the northern wolves burst into the chamber. They weren't shifting. They were staying in their feral forms, their eyes clouded with the weaver's lingering rot. They lunged without a word, a wave of fur and teeth. Instead of hiding, Maren stood her ground. Her magic was gone, but her wolf was still there, snarling in the back of her throat. She felt her bones begin to shift, the familiar heat of the transformation ripping through her. In the span of a breath, she was no longer a broken seer. She was a white wolf, small but lethal, standing shoulder to shoulder with the massive black beast that was her king. Rather than a fight, it was a massacre of the soul. Maren recognized the wolves attacking them, men and women she had grown up with, people who had once guarded her cave. She had to bite, to tear, and to kill the only family she had ever known to save the man she loved. What's worse was the appearance of the weaver's shadow once more. It didn't manifest as a monster this time. Instead, it drifted like a mist, wrapping around Valerius's legs and slowing his movements. It was trying to tether him to the spot, to turn the cavern into his tomb. To make things worse, Maren saw her alpha, or what was left of him, standing at the edge of the fray. He held a small, shivering figure by the hair, her sister. In a single heartbeat, the world shifted. The point of no return had arrived. More importantly, Maren realized that Weaver was using her sister's life force to anchor Valerius. If she didn't act now, the king would be consumed, and her sister would be a hollow husk before the sun rose. By the time she reached the alpha, her white fur was stained crimson, her eyes wide with a desperate burning fire. Eventually, she shifted back to human form mid-leap, her body slamming into the alpha with the force of a falling star. She didn't use a needle this time. Truth be told, she didn't need magic. She used the jagged stone from the floor, the one the boy had given her for luck, and drove it into the alpha's throat. No matter how hard she tried, she couldn't block out the sound of his final gurgling breath. The purple light in his eyes flickered and died. And the shadow holding Valerius vanished instantly. Maybe it was fate, or maybe it was just the end of a long, dark road, but Maren grabbed her sister and pulled her toward the tunnel. Valerius was there a beat later, his muzzle bloody, his golden eyes searching hers for any sign of regret. "Go!" he roared in her mind, the pack link still functioning even if her prophecy was dead. "Take her to the sanctuary. I will hold the tunnels." Before either could speak, the roof of the echo chamber began to collapse. The Weaver was throwing the mountain down to bury them all. In a single heartbeat, the world shifted. Maren looked at the map in her hand, then at the man who had given her a reason to live. She knew that if she stayed, they would all die. If she left, she might never see him again. As if the world narrowed, she made her choice. She kissed his snout, her tears disappearing into his black fur, and turned to run. While her pulse raced, she carried her sister into the dark, the sound of the cave-in roaring behind them like a dying god. She didn't look back. She couldn't. With a single glance at the fading light of the chamber, she saw Valerius turning back to face the remaining wolves. A king defending his people's future with nothing but his own teeth and claws. Between them something cracked, the final bond of her old life. She was no longer the girl in the salt cave. As her wolf stirred, Maren felt a new kind of power rising. It wasn't the star's magic, it was the raw, unyielding strength of a female protecting her mate. With every heartbeat, she promised the moon that she would return. And she let it happen, the darkness swallowing her and her sister as they fled toward the secret path. The act ended, not with a vision, but with the cold, hard reality of survival. Maren was a traitor, a savior, and a wolf without a pack, and she was just getting started. The darkness of the tunnel felt like a physical weight, but the silence following the collapse of the cavern was what truly crushed Maren's soul. What followed was a nightmare of snow and shadows. Maren dragged her sister through the narrow mountain pass, her lungs screaming for air in the thin, frozen atmosphere. Every few steps, she turned her head back toward the citadel, half expecting to see a black wolf leaping through the trees, but the horizon remained a jagged line of uncaring stone. Because the pack link had gone silent the moment the mountain groaned, she had no way of knowing if Valerius was alive or buried under 1,000 tons of rock. She felt a cold, hollow despair beginning to take root, a feeling far worse than the fear she had lived with in the salt caves. Without warning, her sister Lyra collapsed into a drift of waist-deep snow. Her face was the colour of ash, and her breath was a shallow, rattling sound that made Maren's heart stumble. "I can't. Go on," Lyra whispered, her fingers fumbling for Maren's hand. Still, Maren pulled her up, her voice cracking as she spoke. "You have to. We are almost at the sanctuary. Valerius gave his life for this moment, Lyra. Don't let it be for nothing." Yet, as the wind whipped around them, Maren realized they weren't alone. Shadows danced between the trees, moving with a fluid, unnatural grace that didn't belong to any wolf. The Weaver hadn't been defeated by the cave-in. Rather, it had been angered, Soon after, a massive blow struck Maren from behind. She didn't see the attacker, but she felt the ribs on her left side snap as she was tossed into a jagged outcrop of rock. Pain exploded behind her eyes, white and blinding. Before she could move, a figure stepped out of the swirling snow. It was Hera, the Citadel's beta, but her golden eyes were gone, replaced by the swirling purple mist of the void. Instead of a friend, Maren saw a predator. Hera's plan to protect the king had backfired spectacularly, and now she was nothing more than a puppet for the dark god. "He is dead, little seer," Hera hissed, her voice a chorus of 1,000 tormented souls. "Your king is a feast for the worms, and you are next." Rather than fear, Maren felt a sickening wave of defeat. If Valerius was gone, the world had no colour left. What followed was a brutal, one-sided struggle. Maren tried to shift, but her body was too broken, her spirit too crushed by the loss of the bond. Hera lunged, her claws tearing into Maren's shoulder, pinning her to the ice. What's worse was the realization that the map Valerius had given her was missing. It must have fallen during the blast. In a single heartbeat, the world shifted. Maren had no magic, no mate, no map, and no way to save her sister. To make things worse, the Weaver's voice began to echo inside her head, mocking her choices. "You thought you could rewrite the stars? Look at you, a traitor to your blood and a failure to your lover." By the time Hera raised her hand for the final strike, Maren had stopped fighting. She closed her eyes, waiting for the end she had seen so many times in her visions. Eventually the blow didn't come. Instead, a terrifying howl ripped through the valley, a sound so full of grief and rage that it made the very trees tremble. But it wasn't Valerius. It was the sound of the Weaver manifesting fully, using Hera's body as a bridge. Truth be told, Maren had reached her dark night of the soul. She lay in the snow, watching the purple light consume the sky, feeling the last spark of hope flicker and die in her chest. She had sacrificed everything, her magic, her pack, her sister's safety, only to end up in a grave of her own making. No matter how hard she tried, she couldn't find the strength to stand. She looked at Lyra, who was staring at the shadow with wide, vacant eyes, and realized she had led them both to their deaths. Maybe it was fate, or maybe it was just the cruelty of the universe, but in that moment of utter despair, Maren saw a single golden hair caught on her tunic, a piece of Valerius's fur. Before either could speak, the shadow lunged again. But this time Maren didn't move to defend herself. She just held the golden hair against her heart and let the darkness take her. While the silence roared in her ears, her thoughts spun back to the salt cave. She realized that her deepest fear hadn't been the king's death, but the fact that she was the one who had to watch it happen. In the quiet that followed, the forest held its breath. The snow continued to fall, burying the two sisters in a shroud of white. The goal seemed impossible. The hero was broken, and the darkness had finally won. As if fate whispered, a single tear froze on Maren's cheek, and she had no more visions to guide her, and for the first time she was truly, terrifyingly alone. The act ended with the sound of the wind howling through the empty mountain passes, carrying away the names of those who had dared to dream of a different ending. Maren's bones remembered him, but her soul was drifting into a sleep from which there was no awakening. The snow was a cold shroud, but the heat of a single golden hair against her palm was the spark that brought Maren back from the edge of the grave. What followed was a slow, painful awakening. Maren dragged her frozen limbs from beneath the snow, her chest burning as she forced herself to breathe. Beside her, Lyra was a pale statue, but a faint pulse still flickered in her neck. Because Maren had surrendered to despair, the weaver's shadow had moved on, believing her finished. She felt a sudden, sharp surge of rage, not at the stars, but at herself. She realized that by giving up, she was letting the darkness win without a fight. Without warning, a light appeared through the trees. It wasn't the purple rot of the void, but a warm, flickering orange. A group of wolves from the citadel's outer patrol appeared, led by the young boy's mother. They had defied the lockdown to find their luck-bringer. "We felt the mountain fall," the woman whispered, wrapping a thick fur around Maren's shivering shoulders. "But we knew you weren't gone. A star doesn't just go out." Still, Maren's voice was a ghost of its former self. "He's gone. Valerius is... he stayed behind." Yet, the woman didn't weep. Rather, she pulled a small familiar object from her tunic, the polished stone Maren had used to kill the Alpha. "Just then we fight for what he left behind. We fight for you." Soon after, they reached a hidden cave near the summit. Inside, the surviving members of the pack were huddling together. Maren looked at them and didn't see subjects. She saw a family that refused to be orphaned. Instead of a vision, she had something better, a plan. She realized that the weaver didn't want the king for his crown. He wanted the king because Valerius was the only one strong enough to house a god's power. Rather than waiting for her wounds to heal, Maren stood before the small group. She didn't have her magic, but she had her voice. "The weaver thinks we are broken because we lost our king. In fact, we are only dangerous now because we have nothing left to fear." What's worse was the news that Hera, the possessed beta, was marching toward the sanctuary with a horde of shadow wolves. In a single heartbeat, the world shifted. Maren realized this was the final push. She had to lead these people into a battle they weren't meant to win. To make things worse, Lyra finally opened her eyes, her voice a dry rasp. "He's alive, Maren. I can feel him. He's the heart of the mountain now." More importantly, this revelation changed everything. If Valerius was still breathing beneath the rock, then the prophecy wasn't finished. It was just waiting for a new ending. By the time the sun began to peek over the jagged peaks, Maren was arming the pack with whatever they could find: teeth, claws, and a desperate hope. Eventually, they saw the shadow horde at the base of the summit. Hera stood at the front, her body twisted and elongated, a puppet of pure malice. Maren stepped out onto the ledge, her white fur bristling as she shifted one last time. Truth be told, she didn't look like a seer anymore. She looked like a queen. No matter how hard she tried, Hera couldn't stop the primal howl that Maren let out, a call that echoed through the valleys and deep into the roots of the mountain. It was a summons to the man buried in the dark. Maybe it was fate, or maybe it was the raw power of their bond, but the ground began to tremble again. This time it wasn't a cave-in. Rather, it was an explosion. From the base of the citadel ruins, a massive pillar of black fur and golden light erupted into the sky. Before either could speak, the weaver's horde faltered. Valerius was back, his body scarred and bleeding, but his eyes were brighter than any star Maren had ever seen. In a single heartbeat, the world shifted. Maren didn't wait for him to reach her. She lunged off the cliff, her white form a streak of lightning against the grey sky. While her pulse raced, she felt the air thicken with the scent of pine and old magic. She wasn't running to him for protection. She was running to him to finish the fight. With a single glance, they locked eyes across the battlefield. The bond pulsed, etched in fire. Between them, something cracked, the very foundation of the Weaver's power. They weren't two halves of a prophecy anymore. They were one force of nature. As her wolf stirred, Maren felt a new magic blooming. It wasn't the stars' magic. It was the magic of the earth and the pack. It was a burning, intense fire that no shadow could touch. With every heartbeat, they closed the distance, the pack following them into the fray with a roar that shook the heavens. And she let it happen, her heart finally at peace. The final confrontation was here, and for the first time Maren knew exactly how it was going to end. The stars had predicted his death, but they had forgotten that the moon always rises again. Maren bared her teeth as she collided with the first shadow wolf, the silver needle of her past replaced by the lethal grace of her future. The final collision felt like the world had been ripped in two, but the heat of Valerius's fur against hers was the only thing that mattered in the chaos. What followed was a storm of teeth and starlight. Maren and Valerius fought as one. Their movements perfectly synced, as if they shared a single soul. Because the old prophecy was dead, the Weaver had no power to predict their strikes. Maren lunged at Hera, the possessed beta, and used the raw power of her new, earthbound magic to tear the purple shadows away from her skin. Every bite she took felt like she was reclaiming her home, her family, and her future. Without warning, the Weaver let out a final, desperate scream. The purple mist gathered into a single towering shape of pure malice, trying to crush them under the weight of 1,000 years of tragedy. "Together!" Valerius's voice roared in her mind, a golden command that filled her lungs with fire. What followed was the climax. Maren didn't reach for a silver needle. Rather, she reached for the bond that pulsed between them like a sun. She touched Valerius's nose, and in that moment, their combined light exploded outward. It wasn't a flash of destruction, but a wave of absolute truth. In a single heartbeat, the world shifted. The Weaver couldn't survive in a world where two people chose each other over destiny, and with a final pathetic hiss, the dark god vanished into the wind. Still, the battle wasn't over until the silence returned. The shadow wolves collapsed, their eyes clearing as the possession broke, and Hera fell to the snow, gasping for air but finally herself again. Yet, Maren didn't look at the defeated enemy. Rather, she turned to Valerius, who was shifting back into his human form. He was covered in blood and grime, but he was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. "Is it over?" he asked, his voice a raw whisper as he pulled her into his arms. Soon after, Maren shifted back, her skin shivering as the cold air hit her. She looked up at the sky and saw that the stars were just lights again. No longer a script, just a decoration. "It's over," she whispered, her chest aching with joy so intense it felt like a new kind of pain. "We're free, Valerius." Instead of a kingdom built on fear, Maren saw the pack beginning to rise from the snow, helping each other up and tending to their wounds. A sense of belonging and acceptance washed over her, stronger than any magic she had ever leaked in the past. Rather than returning to the ruins of the old citadel, they led the pack toward the hidden mountain sanctuary. It was a lush green valley tucked between the peaks, a place that had never appeared in any of Maren's dark visions. What's worse was the memory of her sister, but as they reached the entrance of the sanctuary, Lyra was there, standing with the young boy and his mother. In a single heartbeat, the world shifted. Maren ran to her, the two sisters collapsing into a hug that smelled of pine and safety. To make things worse, the sun began to rise, but for the first time, Maren wasn't afraid of the light. More importantly, she realized that her transformation was complete. She had started as an assassin who only saw death, and she was finishing as a protector who only saw life. By the time the pack settled into their new home, the found family they had built was etched into every face around the campfire. Eventually, Valerius found her standing by a crystal-clear lake at the edge of the sanctuary. He wrapped his arms around her waist, his chin resting on her shoulder. "I have a confession," he murmured, his breath warm against her ear. Truth be told, Maren already knew what he was going to say, but she wanted to hear it anyway. "I would have stayed in that cave-in forever if it meant you got away," he said, his grip tightening. "But my wolf wouldn't let me die because he knew you were still breathing." No matter how hard she tried, Maren couldn't stop the tears of relief from falling. She turned in his arms, her hands framing his face. "I don't need the stars to tell me we're going to be okay," she said. Maybe it was fate, or maybe it was just the beginning of their happily ever after. But Valerius kissed her with a passion that felt like a burning, intense fire. It was a steamy, emotional moment that carried the weight of every sacrifice they had made. Before either could speak, the pack let out a collective howl, not of war but of celebration. And the king was no longer meant to be destroyed, he was meant to be loved. In a single heartbeat, the world shifted. Maren realized that her magic hadn't disappeared. It had just changed form. It was no longer a curse of sight. It was the magic of a choice well made. While her pulse raced, she felt the mark on her wrist tingle one last time, but the heat was gone. It was just a scar now, a reminder of where she had come from and why she would never go back. With a single glance at the rising sun, she saw a future she had built with her own two hands. Between them something cracked, the last of the old world's rules. They were free to be whoever they wanted to be. As her wolf stirred one last time, Maren felt a deep sense of peace. She was no longer a weapon. She was a woman, a mate, and a leader. With every heartbeat, she felt the sanctuary becoming a home, and she let it happen, her soul finally at rest as she walked back to the campfire with the man she was meant to love. The story ended not with a prophecy fulfilled, but with a life begun. Maren looked back at the mountain one last time and whispered a final goodbye to the girl in the salt cave. The king she was meant to destroy had become the man who saved her, and for the first time, the future was a beautiful, empty page.